And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Hi there, I'm National Weather Service meteorologist Peter Chan with your Alaska Marine Weather Outlook on this Sunday, September 29th, 2024. And this outlook covers Monday into Tuesday. We start with the sea ice. Largely ice-free here throughout the Alaskan Arctic coastline down along the Chukchi Sea coastline. Still a fair amount of ice there, though, off the Russian Arctic coast. And we are now entering the early stages of the new ice building season. So as things continue to gradually cool down, we'll see ice formation begin to increase across the far north. But in the meantime, we're watching a strong area of low pressure. This is a a storm force low that even may have some hurricane force gusts with it. Will have a very well-developed wind field around both the north and southern side of the system. As it lifts up into the lower Gulf, it is expected to deepen to lower mid-950s millibar before it fills and begins to head eastward toward Dixon Entrance later Tuesday into Tuesday night. So by the time we get into Monday afternoon, the low will reach its most intense extent down there around 953, 55 millibars with a well wrapped around occlusion. And this front will have storm force and gale force winds along it as it impacts areas of the Panhandle and the Gulf Coast. Also, those of you with aviation weather background, you're also going to have low-level wind shear along a front like this as it lifts northward into southern and central parts of the Panhandle. By Tuesday, the low begins to fill again, 986 millibars, and will gradually track east-northeastward and further weaken. But we're going to see periods of moderate to locally heavy rain, especially over central and southern parts of the Panhandle, Monday afternoon through Tuesday, lingering into Wednesday. The strongest wind period, though, will likely be later Monday afternoon through Tuesday morning, midday Tuesday. So that'll be when the storm is most impactful there along areas of the Panhandle. And then out to the west, we have a couple of other weaker lows in the Bering Sea, and then a push of warmer air coming out of the North Pacific will quickly occlude as another low comes up out into the Bering here toward the midweek period. But looking at the marine forecast here for Monday, take heed of these winds. Gale force winds, 40 knots, southeast to east gale force winds. There will likely be some higher gusts to storm force, 60, even potentially higher in some of the terrain on the outer coast. For the inner channels, we're looking at southeast to east winds, 30, 40 knots here, strongest down along the south end. Southeast winds to 40 knots, Ketchikan, Metlakatla, Dixon Entrance, where waves could build to 10 feet. In the north, we are looking at north winds 20 knots, 35 knot gale force gusts there in Lynn Canal, waves building to 4 feet. And then look at the waves building in excess out in the central Gulf. They'll be well over 20 feet easily. In fact, some of those waves there will be well over 30. And as we go into Tuesday, we still have for the outer coast, southeast to east, 35 to 40 knot gales. And notice the waves building up, that area moving a little closer to the coastline. Waves upwards of 30 feet off of the coast. For the inner channels, southeast winds 25 to as high as 40 knots down here through Dixon Entrance, 12-foot waves. But northerly winds continue 20 knots there in Lynn Canal with gusts to 35 knots and 4 to 5-foot waves. For the northwestern Gulf, outside of Hinchinbrook Entrance, 30-knot easterly winds. At least a few days ago, it was looking like the low would track a little further westward, but that's not the case. So you're not going to have as strong of winds as what maybe initially it looked like could happen. So, but nevertheless, 35 to 40 knot northeasterly winds off the Kenai coast and just northeast there of Kodiak Island. Lower Cook Inlet northeast winds to 30 knots, 8 to 9 foot waves. And then on Tuesday, we're going to see the winds coming down. Northerly 10 knots within Prince William Sound, northwest winds 15 knots outside of Hinchinbrook Entrance. And then for lower Cook Inlet into northeast of Kodiak City there, easterly winds to 30 knots, 11 to 14 foot waves. Winds may actually try to turn southerly up there in the upper Cook Inlet with 2-3 foot waves there at only 10 knots. So on Monday, along just off of the Kodiak Island, we're looking at northeasterly gales to 45 knots, 15 foot waves, 40 knot gales out of the northeast there within Shelikof Strait, 11 foot waves. And then as we trail down along the Alaska Peninsula. Those winds go northwesterly and fall off to around 20 knots with 3-foot waves. They're offshore Perryville and Sand Point, and generally 2 to 3 foot waves along the Bering side, except for maybe a little higher there north of Cold Bay, up to 5-6 feet. Tuesday, winds turn more westerly across the upper peninsula and the Kodiak Island area at 25 to 30 knots. Still 13-foot waves off of Kodiak Island, 6 foot within Shelikof Strait, and then a little bit more of a mix here. Winds are going to be southwest to westerly 15 knots, trailing out the lower North Pacific end of the peninsula, and then southeast to southwest 15 knots. They are north of Cold Bay. And looking at the Aleutians, northwest winds 20 to 25 knots, far eastern Aleutians around on Alaska. And those winds will go west, and then southwesterly gales, Atka through Adak to Kiska. And then as we get further west, winds turn more westerly. There's a front. You can see that front coming through the central Aleutians associated with a low further just north and west up there in the western part of the Bering Sea. And then across a broad region on Tuesday, southwest winds 20 to 25 knots, eastern Aleutians, and generally 25 or 30 knots, Atka, Adak, westward all the way out toward Kiska and Shemya. For the southwest coast, northeast wind 20 knots out of Bristol Bay, 3-foot waves. East wind 10 knots out of Kuskokwim Bay with 2-foot waves. South winds at St. Matthew, St. Paul at 15 knots, 4 to 5-foot waves. And then offshore east-southeast flow along the lower Yukon Delta, lower south side of Norton Sound with waves right around 2 feet. And by Tuesday, we see winds northwest 15 knots within Bristol Bay, northeast winds 10 knots within Kuskokwim Bay. Southwest winds 25 knots around the Pribilofs with waves 9 feet. Southeast winds 25 knots around St. Matthew with 10-foot waves. And then north to northeast winds 10 to 15 knots, Norton Sound down through along the lower Yukon coast with waves 2 to 3 feet. Across a broad area, the Bering Strait, we'll start south to southeast winds 50 knots along the west side of the Seward Peninsula, north side of St. Lawrence, 3-foot waves, and then going up through the lower Chukchi Sea, generally southeast winds 15 to 20 knots, waves 3 to 4 feet. Along the Arctic coast, east to southeast winds 15 knots with waves generally running right around 2-3 feet. For Tuesday, easterly winds 20 to as high as 25 knots around Kaktovik with waves there 4 to 5 feet, Prudhoe Bay to Kaktovik. And then as we drop on down through the Chukchi Sea, that easterly wind off of Wainwright at 15 knots will turn more north to northeast 10 knots across the lower, the lower Chukchi Sea coastline from Cape Lisburne and Point Hope all the way down to Shishmaref with 2-foot waves. And then as we pass through the Bering Strait, we're looking at northeast to east winds at 10 knots, especially going out toward the north side of St. Lawrence Island, where waves will be running a couple of feet there during the day on Tuesday.